I always knew Sundays were a performance, not a gathering, a stiff, overcooked roast wrapped in decades of unresolved tension, pride baked into the potatoes, and shame tucked under the napkins next to the steak knives. For years, I played my part in silence, smiling when appropriate, nodding through the stories about Brad's latest conquest, the business deals, the keynote speeches, the investors who just can't wait to throw money at him. I sipped my wine like it could keep the bile down, always counting the seconds until I could excuse myself without raising suspicion or drama. But today was different. Today, I wasn't just enduring the show. I was ending it. The dining room hadn't changed since I was in high school. Same wallpaper, same antique chandelier that buzzed if the air conditioner kicked on. Same coffee mug in front of my dad, navy blue, chipped on the handle, said "World's #1 Dad" in faded white letters. I've seen that same coffee mug on his table for 22 years, since I was maybe, 7? No, wait, I'm 37, so that makes it, 31 years. Right? Brad was already talking before I'd even sat down fully, launching into some animated story about a developer he just hired for his newest startup. Something about AI and logistics. I stopped listening after seed round. Mom smiled like a woman whose life depended on the illusion of peace. She handed me a plate stacked with meat, potatoes, a few sad-looking green beans. "Here, sweetheart," she said softly, like I hadn't been in this exact seat every Sunday for 2 decades. Like I hadn't heard her say that through clenched teeth each time Dad began one of his speeches. Then it came, the moment that always came, without fail, somewhere between the second helping and dessert. My father leaned back in his chair like a king who'd just surveyed a conquered land, then turned toward me with a smirk that could curdle cream. "You know," he said, raising his mug like a gavel, "your brother's building something real. He's creating jobs, shaking hands with people that matter. He's out there growing up. Meanwhile, you're still playing make-believe in that little office of yours." He chuckled as if he'd just made a harmless joke, the kind that families laugh at over pie. "When are you gonna grow up and stop pretending to be, what is it you call yourself again? A therapist?" I looked at him. Really looked at him. Not like a daughter who wanted to prove herself, not like a child anymore. I saw a man too small to understand who I'd become. A man who mistook volume for power and ridicule for guidance. I set my fork down quietly, folded my hands in my lap, and smiled. Not the brittle, forced smile I'd perfected since I was 12, but something else entirely. Something older. Sharper. "I already did," I said calmly, like I was discussing the weather. "I just don't celebrate it with people who never believed I would." His mug froze midair. The room fell silent. Brad stopped chewing. My mother glanced between us like a deer sensing an oncoming car, but too scared to move. I saw the flicker in Frank's eyes, not confusion, not anger, but something more fragile. Recognition. Like a man watching a building collapse and finally realizing he never laid a foundation. "I beg your pardon," he said, voice tight. I stood up. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just deliberately. The way you leave a funeral once the dirt's been thrown. "No need to beg," I said, grabbing my purse. "Just keep drinking that coffee and pretending you didn't help break everything good in this family." "Sit down," he snapped, voice cracking like old wood. But I didn't. I walked past the roast, the plates, past Brad's dumbfounded expression, and my mother's wide, frozen eyes. My heels echoed down the hallway like a countdown. I stopped at the front door, hand on the knob, and turned around just once. "I'm not angry," I said. "I'm just done pretending this is normal." And then I left. For the first time. Without finishing my meal, without clearing my plate like a good daughter should. I didn't slam the door, I didn't have to. The silence behind me was louder than anything I could have said. What he didn't know, is that I've been planning this exit for months. Not just from that table, but from all of it. The expectations. The condescension. The fake praise and the whispered dismissals. I've been building something, too. Something quieter. Something stronger. But unlike Brad's glossy pitch decks and LinkedIn updates, mine doesn't need applause. It just needs time. And Frank? He has no idea what's coming. It's funny how you can grow up in the same house as someone, eat the same dinners, sleep under the same roof, and yet feel like you've been raised in a completely different universe, one ruled by unspoken rules that only ever seem to apply to you, where every achievement came with an asterisk and every mistake turned into a moral failing. My brother Brad could have set the backyard on fire and Dad would have handed him the garden hose with a chuckle, calling it curiosity, while I could have sneezed too loudly in church and gotten a full 30-minute lecture about discipline and respect. He was the golden boy from day one, big blue eyes, perfect teeth, a confidence that bloomed early and never wilted. Even his lies sounded like leadership. I remember the first time I realized I was the other child, not just in passing moments, but as a living, breathing identity. I must have been about 11, maybe 12. I'd won the regional science fair with a project on photosynthesis that I'd worked on for 3 months straight, skipping sleepovers and cartoons, practically living in the garage with that stupid lamp set up and rows of bean plants. When they called my name at the county auditorium and handed me that little plastic trophy, I felt something shift inside me, like maybe, just maybe, I was finally going to matter at home, even just a little. We came back late that evening, and I still remember walking through the front door, clutching that trophy like it was solid gold, expecting hell, hoping for something, anything. A smile. A pat on the back. A hey, look at you. Instead, Dad barely looked up from the newspaper. He said, "That's cute," then turned the page. No joke. That's all he said. That's cute. Like I'd just glued some macaroni on construction paper. The next day, Brad came home with a C- in algebra, and Frank took him out for ice cream to cheer him up, said grades weren't everything, and he was proud of him for trying. It was always like that. Always. Brad could fart in a boardroom, and they'd call it innovation. I learned early on to hide my wins because celebrating them just made the silence worse. It didn't change in high school. If anything, the gap between us grew wider, the contrast sharper. I got into Columbia, on a partial scholarship for psychology. I came home with the letter clutched in my hand, barely able to breathe from excitement and fear. Frank read it over dinner, chewed his roast beef, and said, "Wasting time. You'll come crawling back after a year once you figure out feelings don't pay bills." That line stayed with me longer than any diploma ever could. If you're not making money, you're not making sense. That's the kind of gospel he lived by. I think he saw the world in numbers and dollar signs, binary success or failure, no shades of gray, no value in anything that couldn't be sold or measured. I could have been a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, and he still would have asked how much I made last quarter. Brad, on the other hand, got to fail out of 2 colleges, drift through a year figuring things out, then announce one Christmas that he was starting something big. Frank toasted him with scotch like he'd just launched a rocket into orbit. And to be fair, Brad had that charm. He could walk into a room and make people believe they were lucky just to be breathing the same air. It wasn't his fault, really. He was just raised like a prince. It's hard to blame royalty for forgetting the castle doesn't clean itself. I tried to stay invisible after college. Moved out quietly, rented a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, worked 3 jobs at once just to cover tuition and food. Frank never visited. Never asked. Brad stopped by once, dropped off a houseplant, and said, "It's temporary, right?" I smiled and said sure, even though I knew I wasn't just building a career, I was building a life that didn't require their applause. That plan died a month later. Too much shade, not enough light. But sometimes, life throws you a breadcrumb. A crack in the armor. A glimpse behind the curtain. And it came in the most unexpected way, through something Brad left behind. Last Christmas, I let him crash in my guest room for a couple nights while his condo got fumigated or renovated or something equally flashy. He dropped a folder while packing up, and it slid halfway under my bed. Normally I wouldn't snoop, but something about the handwriting caught my eye. Dad's handwriting. Messy. Angry. Familiar. Inside was a note, handwritten, folded in half and shoved between two sheets of legal paper. No date. Just a line, scrawled in all caps. You tell anyone about that, and you're out for good. No signature, but I didn't need one. The tone, the threat, the ego dripping off the page, it was my father's voice, clear as day. I read it over and over, each time hearing that gravelly bark in my head, the one I used to cower from as a kid. Something had happened. Something Brad wasn't supposed to talk about. And Dad had threatened to cut him off if he did. But what? What could Golden Boy possibly know that would make Frank that angry, that scared? I put the note back exactly where I found it, said nothing, but my mind started working in overdrive. For the first time in a long time, I realized something strange. Brad might not just be the favorite. He might be the liability. And that? That gave me something I'd never had before in that house. Leverage. There's a different kind of quiet in my office, the kind that doesn't feel like emptiness, but intention. The stillness of things that matter, of words that are waiting to be spoken, of stories that need space to breathe. The shelves stretch floor to ceiling, filled with textbooks I actually read and journals scribbled with years of notes and breakthroughs and tears, mine and others. This isn't some polished Pinterest therapist den with soft jazz and lavender candles. It's lived in, slightly cluttered, with real fingerprints on the table and photos of women who fought like hell to become something more than what was done to them. Some days I think this space is more church than clinic. There's Norah on the shelf, framed photo from 2 years ago, arms wrapped around her daughter, both smiling like they finally remembered how. It took time, therapy, planning, a goddamn underground railroad of support, and still the court made her fight tooth and nail just to prove she had a right to live in peace. That kind of exhaustion doesn't leave bruises, but it cuts deep in places only women seem to understand. She came to me 5 years ago, hollowed out and twitchy, flinching at the sound of her own breath, wearing sunglasses indoors even though we both knew the bruises weren't from the sun. She sat right there on that brown leather couch and whispered things no one had ever believed. He had money, charm, a smile you could sell to a bank, and fists that came down like thunder when the cameras were off. His name was Paul Winters, and I didn't know then that I'd seen his name before on the employee roster at my father's factory, tucked into some business Christmas card sent out to clients, even mentioned once in passing during a barbecue where Dad called him reliable as hell. That man nearly killed her. Not once. Repeatedly. And Frank, my father, kept him on the payroll for years like nothing ever happened. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Maybe Dad didn't know. Maybe Paul kept it hidden, showed up every day with his lunch pail and his lies, kept his fists to himself inside factory walls, and only turned cruel at home. But then Norah brought me the receipts, literal ones. Emails, voicemails, reports, warnings from other employees that had gone nowhere. She'd gone to HR once. Guess who signed off on the dismissal of the complaint? Frank McMillan, factory floor manager and resident goddamn patriarch. Not only did he know he protected the bastard, told Norah to deal with her personal drama on her own time, and reminded Paul he was valuable to the team. That was the moment something shifted inside me, not rage, not quite. Something colder. Something surgical. I didn't scream or throw things. I opened a notebook, turned to a clean page, and started writing. Not about pain. About patterns. Dates. Names. Connections. I wasn't just helping Norah escape. I was building a case, stacking facts like bricks until a structure formed, one strong enough to stand up in court or fall like a hammer if it came to that. Norah stayed. We met twice a week. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she just sat in silence and let the clock tick. But she stayed. That matters more than people realize. One session turned into 10. 10 turned into a plan. A year later, she filed for full custody. She won. And then she disappeared, legally, safely, new name, New job, new town. She called me from a number I didn't recognize and said 2 words, "We're free." I hadn't cried in months, but I cried that day. I didn't think I'd hear from her again. Not really. I figured she'd build her life, and I'd stay here, doing the work, fighting the same fight over and over again. But Norah surprised me, she always did. She came back. Not in person, but with a message, a voice note sent late one night that I played 5 times before believing it was real. She said she'd been watching everything from afar, keeping tabs, still reading the newspaper in the city where it all started. And she'd seen my name on a list of local therapists honored by the community. Small thing, but it meant something. She said she wanted to do something bold. Loud. Final. I want to go public, she said. Not for revenge. For liberation. For every woman who sat where I sat and thought no one would believe them. I played the message again. Then again. I sat in this chair, under the lamp with the busted shade, staring at her picture. That smile, not fake anymore. Real. Hard-earned. And I knew what I had to do. The wheels started turning. I started thinking in headlines, camera angles, city council meetings, newspaper op-eds, and press releases. I started imagining the sound of my father's voice when he read Norah's story on the front page, when the name of the man he protected was dragged into daylight, when the fortress he'd built on pride and ignorance began to crack. This wasn't about therapy anymore. This was about legacy and whose story would be told. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped being a daughter trying to earn his approval. And I started being a woman with teeth, with records, with witnesses. And Norah? She wasn't just a survivor. She was the spark. And I was the fuse. Brad showed up 2 days after I got Norah's message, unannounced but not unwelcome, which in itself was already a surprise considering we hadn't spoken beyond birthday texts and holiday gritted teeth exchanges in years. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe just heavier, not physically, but the way people carry too many expectations that were never really theirs to begin with, like wearing a jacket 3 sizes too big and pretending it fits. I could tell something was wrong before he even said hello, just from the way he paused at the door, hands in his pockets, scanning my little front porch like it was unfamiliar territory, even though we'd grown up 2 blocks away from here. I let him in without making him explain why he came, and he collapsed onto the living room couch like someone who hadn't sat down for real in weeks. His usual confident posture was gone, replaced by a slump I didn't recognize, shoulders forward, eyes dull, fingers rubbing together like he was nervous or trying to feel something. It hit me then, not like a revelation but a slow, dawning truth I hadn't wanted to admit. Brad wasn't the enemy. At least not entirely. He'd been raised in the same burning house I had. He'd just been told he was the chosen one while I was given the fire extinguisher and told to stop whining about the heat. He looked around the room, at the books, the mismatched furniture, the lack of luxury that Frank would have scoffed at, and then he said, I never even wanted to run a company. I wanted to be a chef. And just like that, a wall cracked, maybe not a full collapse, but something shifted. I stared at him. This man who had always seemed so certain, so groomed for success, and saw the boy underneath, the kid who used to steal saltines from the kitchen and build little sandwiches with butter and ketchup, who once burned toast so badly the smoke alarm went off for 20 minutes. I remembered that boy. I even loved him once. He talked for a while, longer than I expected, about the expectations, the late-night anxiety, the way Frank called every week with new suggestions that were really commands, the investors who were more like babysitters, the partners who didn't really trust him, and the suffocating weight of pretending to be a leader when all he really wanted was to open a food truck and make people smile. I listened without interrupting, nodding sometimes, but mostly just watching the exhaustion pour out of him like water from a cracked pipe. And for a brief moment, I felt it, that urge to forgive, to reconnect, to believe that maybe we weren't so different after all. Maybe he hadn't meant to parrot Frank's condescension all those years. Maybe he was just trying to survive in a system that only had room for one golden child and no space for anyone with a different dream. I thought, maybe I don't need revenge. Maybe I just need peace. Then he said it. The thing that burned the bridge before I could even reach for it. He was staring at one of the photos on my wall, a black and white portrait of one of my clients, an older woman with steel gray hair and eyes like broken glass, who'd left her husband after 32 years of silent torment, and Brad said, casual as hell. Yeah. Dad said you were using those broken women to feel superior. Like, therapy by ego or whatever. It landed like a slap, but colder. Slower. Not because I hadn't heard worse, but because it meant everything we'd just shared, the honesty, the soft confessions, the vulnerability, still couldn't unteach the poison our father poured into his ear. Brad hadn't come to make peace. He'd come because he was drowning, and he thought maybe I could throw him a life vest without asking for anything in return. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, not trusting myself to speak without biting. I could feel the heat behind my eyes, not from sadness, but that particular kind of fury women feel when they realize their generosity is being twisted into weakness by someone who's been told their entire life that they're the protagonist of every story. I poured a glass of water, then set it down hard enough to make him flinch. Therapy by ego, I repeated. Is that what he told you? That I built my life helping people to feel better about myself. Brad shifted, uncomfortable. I mean, he said it in passing. I don't know, no, I interrupted, sharp now. You knew what that would sound like, and you said it anyway. He didn't respond. Just stared at the floor like it might give him an answer. I didn't tell him about Norah. Not yet. I didn't tell him about the article or the interview or the names I'd already submitted to the reporter who'd been circling stories like this for years, waiting for someone credible to finally break the seal. I didn't tell him I'd already picked the headline. The Factory of Silence. It was perfect. Clean. Powerful. Loaded. And accurate. I didn't need his apology anymore. I didn't need him to understand me or respect me or even love me. I'd spent too long waiting for scraps of recognition from a family that only knew how to praise noise, not substance. Now I was building something bigger than approval. I was building truth. I was building fire. And if Frank thought I was going to stay quiet while he kept burying the bones under his empire of denial, then he was about to learn something real, something permanent, something that couldn't be undone with a mug of coffee and a condescending grin. He raised me to believe silence was survival. But I'd learned something better. Silence, when chosen, can be a weapon. But when broken, it becomes a reckoning. It was almost poetic how everything came full circle, how we all found ourselves once again seated around the same aging table, flanked by the same mismatched chairs that had heard more silence than laughter over the last 3 decades. Sunday lunch had always been less about nourishment and more about theater, a strange, slow-played ritual where everyone knew their lines, even when they hated the script. This time, though, I wasn't sitting in my usual place out of habit. I chose that seat deliberately, directly across from Frank, with the sunlight hitting his face just enough to make him squint when he tried to meet my eyes. The roast was on the table again, slightly overcooked, slightly dry, seasoned with passive aggression and undercurrent tension. Diane had brought out her usual green bean casserole, the one with the fried onions on top that nobody actually liked, but everyone took a spoonful of anyway to avoid questions. Brad was there, too, seated beside Frank, silent in a way that wasn't discomfort, but defeat. His mouth was tight, and his eyes were somewhere far away, probably back in the dream he never got to follow, probably in some quiet kitchen he'd never own. I noticed he didn't say much when we greeted each other. Just a nod and a weary look, like he was still digesting everything from our last conversation. I didn't rush into it. That was important. Timing is everything when you're about to demolish a foundation someone else built their whole identity on. So I waited. I let Frank go through the motions, chewing, commenting on the stock market, making a few lukewarm jabs at people these days and how nobody wants to work anymore. He even tossed a compliment toward Brad, praising a new investor he'd brought on board like it was a military conquest. And then, just like clockwork, he turned to me. "So," he said, his voice thick with that smug kind of curiosity that's not curiosity at all but bait. "Still doing that therapy stuff? I figured you'd be onto something more substantial by now." I smiled at him, not out of joy but precision. A calculated smile, one that said, "I see you and I'm not afraid anymore." I leaned back in my chair and tapped the rim of my water glass with one finger. Then, calmly, I said, "I've actually been working on something bigger than you'd expect. And it's been going really well." He raised an eyebrow, amused in that condescending way only a man like Frank could master. "Is that so?" I nodded, reached into my bag, and pulled out my phone. "There's a story I want you to see. Just went live this morning. It's already picking up traction, people are sharing it. I think you'll find it familiar." Diane looked confused. Brad shifted in his chair. Frank just chuckled, that low, dismissive laugh he always used when he thought I was about to embarrass myself. "What kind of story?" I hit play. The screen lit up. A local news anchor appeared, polished and confident, introducing a segment titled "The Factory of Silence." The footage cut between blurred images of a manufacturing floor, an unnamed woman's voice recounting years of ignored complaints, whispered warnings, and a workplace culture that turned a blind eye to abuse in the name of production. No names were mentioned. No specific company identified. But the layout of the factory, even blurred, was unmistakable. And the voice, though digitally altered, was undeniably Norah's, calm, clear, resolute. Frank's smirk faded about 30 seconds in. By the 1-minute mark, his hand had frozen mid-reach for his coffee mug. The same mug I'd watched him sip from since I was a teenager. By minute 2, the color had started draining from his face. "Turn that off," he said suddenly, sharp and loud, the authority in his voice cracking at the edges. But I didn't move. I just let it play. I wanted him to hear every word. When the segment ended, I looked at him, really looked, the way you study the last flickers of a dying fire. There was no rage in me, no triumph even. Just clarity. And that's when I said it, calm and clear, "You always wanted me to build something real." So I did. I built an escape hatch for women you ignored. I built a life you'll never understand. He couldn't speak. Not for lack of trying, but because there was nothing left to say. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Brad stayed seated, face unreadable, though his eyes flicked to me with something that might have been respect. Or guilt. Or both. Diane looked like she wanted to say something, anything, but nothing came out. She stood up slowly, as if moving through water, and followed me out of the room when I finally pushed my chair back and stood. I didn't storm out. I walked, deliberate, unbothered, free. On the porch, Diane caught up, opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't ask questions, didn't apologize. Just stood there beside me, looking out at the yard she'd trimmed for 40 years while pretending not to see the roots rotting beneath the surface. "Are you okay?" she finally asked. "No," I said honestly. "But I will be." And then I left. I don't know if Frank felt shame in that moment or just defeat. I don't know if Brad will ever understand what it means to break a cycle instead of inherit one. I don't know if Diane will ever choose truth over quiet. But I do know this, I didn't burn the bridge. I just built a better one. And maybe, someday, they'll cross it. Or maybe not.